Sarah Mohammed and I have the pleasure of moderating this session, during which we'll be examining these emerging or alternative or non-traditional accountability mechanisms as they're described in the program for serious human rights violations and war crimes. And we'll do it with this truly awesome group of speakers. So the plan for today's session is this. I'll begin by briefly introducing our speakers, and then I'll turn the floor over to each of them for brief introductory remarks. After those introductory remarks, I'll pose a few questions to get our discussion started, and we'll leave time for questions after that. One housekeeping note, if you are interested in getting CLE credit for this session, please see one of the ASIL volunteers in the back so that you can sign in and sign out of the session. If you forget to sign in or sign out, you can speak to more ASIL staff at the registration desk. So let me tell you a bit about these terrific speakers. We'll start with Mohammed Al-Abdallah, who's director of the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, which works to document human rights violations and preserve, analyze, and store evidence of violations. The SJC has contributed to criminal investigations in Europe and North America, as well as to specific investigations conducted by the UN Commission of Inquiry. Al-Abdallah has a career as a Syrian human rights and democracy researcher and activist. He covered Syria for Human Rights Watch in Beirut from 2007 to 2009. He's a former prisoner and survivor of torture who was imprisoned in Syria on 2 separate occasions for his work defending human rights and lobbying for political reform. He received a Bachelor of Law from the Lebanese University and a Master of Public Policy from George Mason University with a specialty in governance and international institutions. Next, we'll hear from Michelle Jarvis, who is Deputy Head of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria. She's worked in the field of international criminal justice for over 18 years. Before taking up her post at the IIIM in December 2017, she was the deputy to the prosecutor at the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal, for the former Yugoslavia, and the MICT, the Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals. Prior to her work in international criminal law, Jarvis was a litigator in Australia, where her roles included improving women's access to justice. She's lectured and trained widely on issues concerning international criminal law, and she brings extensive expertise on issues concerning gender and armed conflict, having authored 2 books and numerous articles on the subject. She has a master's degree in law from the University of Toronto and degrees in law and economics from the University of Adelaide. Next, we'll hear from Juan Papier, who's an America's researcher at Human Rights Watch, where his work focuses on Colombia. He's also a senior fellow for the Case Matrix Network. Previously, he was editor-in-chief for the Latin American Journal of International Law, and he taught international and constitutional law at DeTea University in Argentina. And finally, Alexandra Huneeus is professor of law at the University of Wisconsin, where her scholarship focuses on human rights law and international courts with an emphasis on Latin America. In 2017, Huneeus was named to serve a 10-year term as foreign expert jurist in the Colombian Jurisdicción para la Paz, the HEP, which we'll be talking about today, which was created as part of that Colombian peace process. At Wisconsin, she serves as director of the Center for Law, Society, and Justice, and she serves on the editorial boards of the American Journal of International Law, Angel Unbound, and Law and Social Inquiry. She received her PhD, JD, and BA from UC Berkeley and was a postdoc at Stanford. So with that very impressive set of experiences and credentials, I'm delighted to turn over the floor to Mohammed Al-Abdallah for some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being with us here in the Saturday morning. I'll go directly to the point. Before starting to talk about the mechanism itself, how innovative the solution it is, it's helpful maybe to give a context on how things were evolving in Syria in general. If there's one thing that characterized the conflict in Syria is that it is the conflict that was live streamed and recorded live as the violations were occurring from 2011. This is the moment where everybody had their cell phones and they start taking pictures, videos, and they were able to record on lifetime sometimes some of the heavy bombardments the government used against civilians or to crush uprising and protest in certain cities. So with that, the new challenge came out that there's a massive amount of data that's beyond the usual amount of information that will come out from an armed conflict or from a repressive government that's crushing a protest or an unrest, let's say. That triggered lots of activities from the Syrian civil society themselves, even before the UN starts stepping in. So the first initiative the UN took was the UN Commission of Inquiry, which established in August 2011, that around 6 months after the protest was going on in Syria from March till August, and the death toll was around 5,000 people were killed mainly by shooting from security agencies at protesters. So with that context, looking that this is the conflict where we didn't wait till the end of the conflict where the international mechanism of accountability will be mandated and starting, and the documentation and preservation of evidence is happening throughout the conflict from the beginning. So I want to thank the Syrian civil society for their contribution in that, and there's a wide variety of groups who's doing really amazing work on that, but also looking on how the lack of documentation and preservations in some contexts, like Lebanon, our neighbors, that made it very easy to push an amnesty, blanket amnesty to everyone, because we don't know what happened. It's been 15 years. Let's just flip the page about this and move forward. So our efforts hoping to block any basically efforts to sweep the things under the rug. That's one of the main things. Now, the second characterization of the conflict in Syria is that conflict that polarized the Security Council so much that the Russian Federation had used the veto power, sometimes back-to-back in 2 days, to veto the renewal of the JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism between the Security Council and the OPCW regarding chemical weapons. So it's the first time where things being live streamed on TV in the news. We didn't wait till the CNN go and see Srebrenica, the world got shocked, and now, oh, we need to react on this and let's deploy NATO and do an intervention. But it's the same conflict where everybody's watching what's happening, but we cannot do much because Russia is blocking us and China is blocking us. There's, if I remember correctly, 14 to 15 vetoes in the last couple of years on Syria specifically, related to human rights, to cross-border operation, humanitarian aid, etc., let alone the military intervention of the Russian government in Syria. The bombardment of Aleppo and the siege of Aleppo in 2016 and the heavy Russian engagement, the Russian Air Force in Aleppo, that basically triggered the need to do something. And this something ended up being the mechanism, the IIIM, because we cannot sit and watch what's happening there, and we cannot do anything because we're blocked by the Russian and the Chinese government. Meanwhile, between 2011 and 2016, before the General Assembly resolution passed, Russia and China vetoed a draft resolution to refer Syria to the ICC, so to have an ICC jurisdiction over the situation in Syria. And also the couple of governments led by Switzerland issued a letter to the ICC signed by 60 nations asking the ICC to assume some jurisdiction over Syria, which the ICC couldn't based on political ground. And later, when ISIS started emerging in Syria, the ICC was asked to assume some jurisdiction over foreign fighters who are coming from member states. Yeah, from foreign fighters who are coming from states that's member to the Rome Statute and to the ICC, which the ICC responded that's a very narrow jurisdiction. So all these challenges around moving along on the justice and accountability in Syria is actually what characterized the challenges of establishing IIIM. And passing the GA resolution was a great success. It's a starting point. It's the new of its nature. Everything has a new every new thing has a first, or everything has a first time, and IIIM is the first time where the GA try to step in and try to do something to go around the blockage of the Security Council. What does that mean exactly? It means unusual mechanism in its structure. It means unusual work to fundraise. Now, IIIM does fundraising like us, the NGOs, and we feel bad about this because instead of working 100% on analyzing the evidence, they have to dedicate some time and efforts and staff and resources to do fundraising, just like NGOs, and be under these constraints. That means governments unsupportive of the IIIM, like Russia, will continue to point to the mechanism and point it as illegal or abuse of power of the GA, and basically try to undermine this effort. Quickly, one or two final comments is that the mechanism itself has been replicated now. There's a UNITAD for Iraq, and basically to prosecute the crimes the ISIS committed against the Yazidi minority, and there is also Myanmar. Now there's a discussion on the mechanism. However, I start to get alarmed here. It's a good way to go around the Security Council and establish these innovative mechanisms where nobody can veto, precisely, but at the same time, this is not a solution. If every time the Security Council and the United Nations is blocked and basically feel they're basically helpless and they cannot do anything, okay, let's issue a new mechanism for them. Let's put 20 nations to do voluntary funding that will keep everybody busy in the next 3 to 5 years till we figure out something. So this is the dynamic around the IIIM in general. How it's perceived by the civil society is another issue, because the civil society has been documenting for 7 to 8 years, and now everybody is hopeful the mechanism will be able to take this work and turn it to something concrete, case buildings, basically files. However, that's where the IIIM get really squeezed by the civil society, saying, okay, prosecute somebody, put them in prison, but oh, we're quasi-prosecutorial, we're not a court, actually, we're not a tribunal. So we're unable to take yet that final step to make everybody pleased and to assure them that justice has arrived. So it is way in the right, a step in the right direction. It's very supported by the Syrian civil society, but again, with the caveat that the UN should not make this a habit to go around any political dilemmas or challenges at the Security Council. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and add my thanks to those given by Mohammed for being here early on a Saturday morning. We have just, I think, 5 or 6 minutes for these introductory remarks, so I will necessarily be brief and hopefully just give you some ideas about some of the particular elements of this relatively unique, I think, as Mohammed said, it's an unusual mandate that the IIIM has. It was, of course, born out of deadlock in the Security Council. Mohammed has eloquently explained the background to that. So with the possibility of a referral of the Syrian situation to the ICC blocked, with the possibility of an ad hoc tribunal being created for Syria blocked through the Security Council, the solution found was to work through the General Assembly to pass a resolution establishing the IIIM in December 2016. The IIIM, in the end, the resolution was voted for by 105 states in favour, including the United States. So it was a strong show of support for a solution of some sort to push forward the accountability process in Syria. But of course, it isn't a complete solution. The IIIM is considered to be a quasi-prosecutorial office. And what does that mean? Well, of course, the IIIM doesn't have the power to issue indictments. It doesn't have the power to try cases. There will be no judgments issued by the IIIM. But what it can do is really crucial preparatory work to make sure that we are ready with the evidence and the criminal law case files whenever jurisdictional opportunities do emerge. We have some of those opportunities now in terms of national jurisdictions who are addressing crimes committed in Syria under extraterritorial or universal jurisdiction frameworks, and we hope that there indeed will be additional opportunities in the future. What this means for the IIIM is that our big priority is collecting, consolidating and preserving information and evidence about serious crimes committed in Syria since March 2011 onwards. Again, as Mohammed said, by the time the IIIM was set up, many actors, Syrian civil society in particular, had been working for 7 or 8 years, really courageous, tireless work, making sure that they could secure as much of the crucial evidence about crimes in Syria as possible. So the thinking behind the creation of the IIIM is that we really needed a place to collect, consolidate, and ensure the preservation of this evidence in accordance with standards that would maximise the chances that we could use it in criminal proceedings now or in the future. I think that's a really important distinction. I mean, many people wonder about the relationship between the IIIM and a body like the Commission of Inquiry for Syria. The Commission of Inquiry has done crucial work over many years in documenting the occurrence of crimes, collecting a lot of witness statements. What we are able to do is to take the work that they have done as a foundation and then add our own criminal law processes to make sure that we look at the information available strategically from the point of view of criminal law case files against identified individuals that could be prosecuted in a criminal trial. The IIIM does have an investigative mandate of its own, but it's very much focused on filling the gaps in the existing information and evidence. Big emphasis on not duplicating what's been done by others, but really strategically using our additional resources to make sure that we can put together criminal law case files. In practice, what it means is a huge focus for us on issues like chain of custody, making sure that there's really rigorous, thorough documentation of chain of custody issues. When it comes to digital material, which is a huge part of the body of evidence in relation to Syria, this means working with new technologies to make sure that we are forensically preserving material in the most effective way. It of course means that we are working with different standards of proof. We're applying beyond reasonable doubt criminal law standards as opposed to some of the lower standards that are appropriate for human rights fact-finding processes. And we're of course focusing on evidence needed to establish theories of individual criminal responsibility. So really looking at linking the crimes to particular individuals who may bear responsibility. And we're collecting broadly. So witness statements are of course important, but we want the full range of evidence. So that includes documentary evidence, other types of physical evidence, videos, photographs, satellite images, and other forms. We talk a lot about the limitations in the IIIM's mandate, but I did just want to say to all of you that at the same time as the limitations, there are many, many opportunities in the way that our mandate has been crafted. And so for us, I think at the IIIM, the challenge is really to look at those opportunities and to maximise those. So just to throw out a few of these ideas, we have a real opportunity for a much more coordinated approach with civil society. This is an issue that courts and tribunals have grappled with over the years, how to get that balance right, how to appropriately acknowledge the crucial work that civil society has done, the contextual knowledge that they can bring into an understanding about how crimes have occurred. For us, it's a key part of our mandate. You see the language there in our terms of reference. So finding ways to operationalise that effectively is really important. It's not easy. There are many challenges, but I think we already have so many lessons learned that could be very useful for others in the future. Another source of opportunity is certainly harnessing technology from the beginning of our work. Many of the courts and tribunals over the years have struggled with how to manage the sheer volume of evidence that they collected. I know from my experience at the ICTY that certainly that was an issue over the years. No one expected at the beginning in 1993 that the ICTY would have 9 million pages of evidence. In the context of Syria, the volume is something else entirely. We know it is huge, the volume of material that we will be collecting. So having a strategy from the beginning about how to manage that using state-of-the-art technology has been absolutely crucial. Integrating gender as a core part of our work is another significant opportunity. The language in our mandate on gender is strong, and we also have the benefit of so many lessons learned from other accountability processes over the years. So we are working really hard to make sure that we have strategies both institutionally and throughout all of the substantive work that we do. And the last topic before I finish is just to mention the importance of a victim-centred approach to justice and accountability. Again, this is a term we hear over and over again. I think there is a theoretical commitment to a victim-centred approach, but for us it is really about understanding what does that mean in the context of Syria and in the context of a unique mandate like the IIIM's. And that's again where I think we really need the support and assistance of our civil society colleagues and others in accessing the views and perspectives of survivors on what justice means for them and how they want to see that reflected in the discretion that we exercise in putting together criminal law case files. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'll be presenting about the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. This is the judicial body created as part of the 2016 peace accord between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC guerrillas. I'll be presenting about some of the key legal controversies that appear throughout the peace negotiations. And I know Alexandra will be addressing some of the later political constraints the jurisdiction is facing as it tries to carry out its work. The peace negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC started in 2012 and ended in late 2016 after an original version of the accord was slimly defeated in a national plebiscite, and the parties renegotiated a new and final accord, which was passed by Congress in December 2016. Essentially, in terms of accountability, the accord creates what it calls a comprehensive system of truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition, which includes a truth commission, a unit to search for the disappeared, a reparations program, and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace is a body charged with investigating and prosecuting abuses committed throughout the armed conflict by the FARC guerrillas, by members of the Colombian armed forces, and by other actors of the armed conflict. The accord contained several controversies around accountability, and I'll name 3 or 4 depending on time constraints. The first one, which, and I'll say that all of these controversies are still present in the Colombian legal debate nowadays. The first and probably the most, the issue where there has been more debate about is the issue of punishment. The Colombian government had a clear idea since the beginning of the negotiations that they would not offer a blanket amnesty to the FARC. This was mainly for 2 reasons, I would say. The first one was that they knew that a blanket amnesty would not be an acceptable solution for the Colombian society. And the second reason is that they knew it would not be a sustainable solution given the at least emerging trends under international law against amnesties for international crimes. And this was particularly relevant in the context of Colombia, given that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has consistently stated that amnesties for human rights abuses are inconsistent with the American Convention of Human Rights, and that the ICC prosecutor has the situation in Colombia under preliminary examination since 2004 and could eventually open a formal investigation. The FARC, on the other hand, were very clear in the negotiations that they would not be willing to lay down their weapons to see their commanders end up serving long prison sentences. So the parties to the accord initially explored fully suspending the sentences of those convicted, but this idea was disregarded in part because the ICC prosecutor sent a letter to Colombian authorities signaling that fully suspended sentences would run counter to the requirements of accountability under the Rome Statute. So they went on to explore alternative sentences, which and eventually agree that those who confess to their crimes and do not commit new crimes will not serve prison sentences. Instead, they will be convicted to serving community service tasks while they're subject to what are called effective restraints on liberty. What are these effective restraints on liberty? The details, this is being an issue of long debate, and the details have not yet been fully clarified. A second and related issue to that of punishment is the issue of political participation. The FARC had a clear idea throughout the peace negotiations that they wanted to lay down their weapons to participate in the Colombian political debate as part of the democratic arena. But this brought the complicated legal question as to whether they could participate in politics, they could run or hold public office, even while they were serving their sentences for international crimes. And this is an issue that's still open for debate, and is an issue that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has to decide in every specific case. The third and probably last issue I wanted to present is an issue that shows that the debates around the Colombian peace accord are not only debates about the justice versus peace dilemma. They're not only debates about how much justice is needed to ensure a sustainable peace accord, or how much justice is needed to deal away to ensure peace. This is the issue of command responsibility. Essentially, in late 2016, the Colombian army officers publicly and privately pressed the Colombian government to change the definition of command responsibility included in the peace accord, so as to narrow the definition that is applied under international law. This was not. There's a reason for this, and the reason is that at least 19 army generals are under investigation for crimes committed by their troops in extrajudicial executions in the early 2000s. So eventually there was a negotiation between the defense ministry, advisors to the president, and lawmakers, and Congress passed a definition that restricts the requirements under international law, in that it appears to require that commanders knew about the crimes that their troops were committing and had both legal and material control over the crimes committed by their troops. I think I'll end there, and we'll have more time to discuss throughout the questions.
Sorry. Well, good morning. I want to begin by thanking Sarah, and the organizers for the honor of being here. So I'm going to speak very briefly to introduce you to some of the challenges. I think there's three very big, or I've organized them into three very big sort of sets of challenges currently facing the HIP. And one of them is rooted, I think, in the plebiscite, the exercise of the plebiscite that Juan mentioned. After the peace accord was initially signed in September of 2016, the president submitted it to a popular plebiscite because they wanted to get the involvement and participation and buy-in of the country, and this failed. So this exercise in direct democracy showed that there was not a consensus supporting the plebiscite. There's a lot of controversy about how it was made, a lot of arguments that maybe there is and it just wasn't reflected, but ultimately Colombians voted no. And then there was a renegotiation, and the president submits it not to a second plebiscite, but to Congress, because they didn't want to risk having another no vote. And this moment really has, I think, made the peace accord sit on unstable ground, so that the opposition can always claim that there's not a consensus behind the accord and the way it was negotiated in the terms of the peace. And therefore, the opposition can, at every moment, has tried to renegotiate the peace. So, for example, the HIP, the jurisdiction, the special jurisdiction, has now been working for over a year. One of the first things they did was create the project for a statute that will, legislate how the HIP works. This was submitted to Congress. There was a new Congress in place, and the opposition to the peace had done well in the elections. And the first thing they tried to do is change the terms of the peace and create a new jurisdiction for the military, separate from the jurisdiction for the FARC. This eventually failed. The new legislation, after leaving Congress, goes to the Constitutional Court. It comes out of the court. And just a couple of weeks ago, the president now has to sign it, but instead submit 6 objections to this legislation, to the statute. Again, trying to unilaterally renegotiate the terms of the peace and leaving the HIP a year and a month or two into its work without a statute from which to work. So there's this constant political undermining of the work of the HIP and the way that the peace was negotiated that has really hampered and challenged the work of the HIP. I think that's the main issue and bleeds into the other 2 challenges that I am going to highlight. The second challenge is that the HIP is a sui generis and unique exercise in transitional justice. It was originally going to be a hybrid international court, but through the negotiations of the peace, it was decided it would just be national. There weren't going to be international judges. There wasn't going to be some accord with the UN. It's just a national exercise, but it's not part of the regular judiciary. So what this does is the JEP erects a new uncharted jurisdiction in the midst of an existing and deeply institutionalized and complex legal system. And it gives primary jurisdiction over a 50-year civil war to the JEP, but this is a 50-year civil war that has already been litigated extensively in the regular judicial system. So there's cases having to do with this 50-year civil war in all the different judicial instances, in the national prosecutor, in the Supreme Court, Constitutional Court, the administrative court. So you can see that it really creates the setup for complex jurisdictional conflicts. And it also erects this new jurisdiction in the midst of another transitional justice regime negotiated in the early 2000s by the former President Uribe, which was focused on pacifying the paramilitary. But clearly there again, you have many of the cases in that jurisdiction. So this, we live in the United States with 51 different jurisdictions. We understand that this is a setup for a lot of conflict between jurisdictions, and this has been a huge issue. The national prosecutor in particular, which has a lot of the primary investigations of these cases, is an opponent to the current terms of the peace and has used this conflict of jurisdiction to really push against and undermine the JEP. And so this is one of the big challenges. And last, do I have a moment, another minute? I think that the third big challenge is one that that goes a little less noticed, but is internal to the JEP. And I can say a bit more about this later, but the JEP is an incredibly complex institution itself. It is divided into 4 main chambers, so 3 sort of first instance chambers and a court, which itself is divided into 4 different sections. And again, we don't have a statute yet that really lays out how this all works, and this complexity and the fact that it's new makes it very difficult for those operating within the system to really figure out how exactly cases are supposed to flow through the system. And there's been tension within the court itself as to how this should all work. So I would say, and I can say more in the comments, that those are the 3 big challenges: the lack of political consensus, the jurisdictional issues within Colombia, and also without, right? There's the question of the Inter-American Court and the ICC. So there's all these jurisdictional conflicts and overlapping jurisdictions. And then thirdly, the complexity of the institution itself.
Right. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. So I'm going to start posing a few questions to our panelists to further us in this discussion about sort of the future and current work of these institutions. So I'll start with a question about the goals of the institutions. So the IIIM and the JEP, these are institutions that are answerable to multiple constituencies, and they're really born of multiple constituencies. So the IIIM was created by an international body. The creation of the JEP was at least spurred by some pressure from international bodies. Obviously, these are 2 institutions that are answerable, should be answerable to domestic constituencies as well, to victims and communities of people who are affected by the crimes that are at issue. So when you think about these institutions from the perspective of the international community, or from the perspective of those who are actually affected directly by these crimes, what do you each think is the ideal outcome of the work of these institutions?
Do you want to start?
Sure.
I can, but go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I'm glad you posed it. I think it's something we will be thinking about a lot more at the IIIM as we go through the, we're really, I suppose, been operational since May last year. So we are still at a fairly initial stage of our work. But I think what I can say, and it's probably obvious, but it's worth restating, I think the IIIM has to be a vehicle for expediting meaningful justice for the affected individuals, communities in Syria. And that's where some of these concepts that I've been talking about around victim-centred approach really become important, because it's not enough for us as an international community to impose our ideas of what justice means in the context of Syria. We have to find a way to engage and understand what it means for the affected communities. And it's so important that we hear as directly as we can from them, and this is where the engagement with our Syrian civil society partners is important as well. I think for us, what does that mean in practice? Well, there's really the two big components of what we're doing. The backbone of everything is the collection and creation of a comprehensive central repository of information and evidence. So that was really the foundation of everything that we can do in the context of IIIM to expedite justice in Syria. It means that we are preserving material that otherwise might be at risk of being lost, and that's crucial. We know that there is still evidence in precarious locations that needs to be collected and forensically preserved for future proceedings. The benefit that we have, of course, collecting from so many different sources, civil society, from states, from other UN entities, from individuals, is really this notion of aggregation. So by bringing it all together, we really have much more capacity to draw inferences to a criminal law standard than we do if we look at these pieces of evidence in isolation. And we can already see how we start to channel that information and evidence into action that is happening now at the national level. So we have more and more requests for assistance from national prosecutors in Europe and elsewhere, asking if we can look through the evidence holdings that we have and channel material that's responsive to particular issues they're looking at into their proceedings, and we do that. The other big component, of course, is the case file building. It's a longer process. We have 2 case files open, but again, it really is about thinking, are there opportunities for these case files to be prosecuted in the near future? And even if there's not, we know we need to start the long process, complex process of building the bigger case files that might be the foundation for prosecutions in the future.
I want to add a few things as a Syrian, let's say, and I'm very biased to the IIIM, I'm supportive, but the reason I think IIIM is maybe better than a tribunal at the moment for Syria is indeed the cooperation between IIIM and the civil society. This is something most of the tribunal crumbled with, as Michel mentioned, and because of the nature of the investigatory mandate of the IIIM and the assistance they're providing to the civil society on the preservation, indeed, that's making the civil society getting closer to the IIIM. The civil society and IIIM signed a protocol of cooperation last year between IIIM and 28 Syrian civil society to bring this cooperation to more organized manner, which is something very helpful. The other elements is the civil society worked closely with lots of member states and governments and received financial and political support. However, sharing classified materials with NGO is still sensitive and difficult versus sharing classified materials with a UN-mandated entity is something possible. And that's where the member states are crossing the line to share information, or some of them to the IIIM to endorse or support some of the investigation. This is an important aspect. To me also as a Syrian, while I see the peace agreement is moving really slowly in a bad track in Geneva with the Russian attempt to sabotage the negotiation and move it from Geneva to Astana and then later to Sochi, I think an entity, UN-mandated entity like IIIM is the only hope to say you cannot ignore what happened. Even if the peace agreement decided to, the UN Special Envoy Office decided to move forward without mentioning any accountability, the fact that IIIM is an independent entity and it's impartial, it works at its mandate, does not report really to any peace entity or to the Office of Special Envoy in negotiation, that's enough guarantees for us as Syrians at the moment that there is UN entity looking for the justice issue. I want to highlight one example when Staffan de Mistura, the former Special Envoy for Peace Negotiation, came to the Security Council in August 2017 and gave unbelievable remarks, how things are great on the ground and how the hostilities are ceasing. And the next morning, the Commission of Inquiry, but before the IIIM setup quickly moved forward, the Commission inquiry came out with 32 pages of analysis, how the situation is even going back and worse. So to have another UN entity calling the UN entity might sacrifice the justice just in favor of a quick peace, or what they try to promote usually, a bad peace better than any war. The final comment is definitely related to universal jurisdiction cases, where those cases are being basically increased in Europe, in Germany, in France, and in Netherlands, and Sweden, and Spain. But to have also a coordinated effort like the IIIM to work with prosecutor, one of the comments we received from the Dutch prosecutor, and we coordinate with these entities a lot, is that looking for an evidence in the case of Syria is going for a library with millions of books with no titles and trying to look for a specific line in a book that we don't know where it sits. So it's going to take them a lot actually to find. So the state-of-art technology Michel is referencing, and organizing all the information and aggregating and cross-checking everything in one place, it's really important. And final comment is actually the transitional justice mandate, which is usually tribunals doesn't go a lot on transitional justice. Like criminal prosecution, let's put 5 people behind bars and that's all about it. So to read on the TORs of IIIM that there's emphasis on transitional justice, that IIIM would be concerned about matters like the missing people, for example, or endorsing programs of missing people, is something helpful for us victims to hear. Actually, the UN has changed and somehow in the way that it's looking at criminal prosecution or international justice, let's say.
Juan and Alexandra?
Sure. I'd say that the special jurisdiction for peace, it needs to deliver meaningful justice that is acceptable first to victims, to the international community, and ideally to the opposition to the accord. Which brings me back to the issue of legitimacy that Alexandra raised. And I think this is clear in the efforts that the special jurisdiction is trying to do in its initial stages. It has selected 7 cases to start with, and there is an obvious effort to have balanced cases. There are 3 cases about specific zones of Colombia, and then there are 4 cases, 2 involving abuses by the army and 2 involving abuses by the FARC. And the 2 cases about abuses by the FARC are cases which involve the most serious crimes and the crimes that have been more, more mediatic and more discussed, including kidnappings and child recruitment. And I'd say there are 2 other factors that will be important to determine whether the justice delivered by a special jurisdiction is acceptable for everyone in Colombia. One is how fast the special jurisdiction is able to operate. If it delays its work too much with this complicated system and with the huge volume of cases it has, it will probably further undermine its legitimacy in Colombia. And the second is the issue of conditionality. The whole system is built up on an idea of carrots and sticks, where defendants are allowed to serve alternative sentences and have a range of benefits if they cooperate with the system. And I think the Colombian society needs to see that those carrots and sticks will operate correctly, and those who commit new crimes or do not confess to their crimes are seriously punished.
So I would echo much of what Juan just said. I would think the first thing the HIP has to do, however, is simply survive. The constant attacks and questioning and unraveling, the challenges that a few weeks ago, one of the prosecutors was filmed accepting a bribe, one of the HIP prosecutors, and the national prosecutor, who's this enemy of the HIP, posted this, on their website right away and made a huge announcement about it on the eve of the president's 6 objections to the law. So there's this constant stream of attacks, and I think the challenge for them is to just keep working, right? To keep their heads down and trying to go through the cases in the midst of this turbulent context. So if they're able to survive all this, I echo everything that Juan says. I think the one of the salas that is charged with sort of the reconocimiento, so acknowledgement of responsibility, has decided that they're going to work by focusing on a few very large paradigmatic cases that have a lot of symbolic and political meaning. I think they've chosen well those cases. They've along the lines Juan said, and there's some that are focused on geographical regions that were particularly hard hit. There's some cases focused on particularly notorious types of crimes. So the kidnappings of the FARC and the false positives of the government are two of the cases. So these are I think that while they're doing these cases that are very highly symbolic and meaningful for the society, and they're going to have to choose, right? They can't do all the cases. And on the other hand, the other salas, the other chambers have to be very efficiently processing the legal status of all of the FARC members who have come forward and signed in and become part of the HIP process, and all of the military members who have. So those salas are trying to move forward quickly, focused on their work, turning cases quickly, while this other sala has a more prominent political role. And I think it's an interesting balance, and it could, if they're able to just keep moving forward, despite not having a statute and despite constant political attacks, that would be amazing, and that would be a great contribution to the piece.
So I'll turn now to a question about how to think about these accountability mechanisms in the context of the larger international law and international approaches to mass human rights abuses. So in the program description, for example, these are described as unusual mechanisms or as alternative accountability mechanisms. So do you agree with the characterization of these as alternative? And if they are alternative, then what are you thinking of as the norm in our international approaches to these kinds of crimes at this point?
Okay. Yeah, again, interesting question. I think we have to accept that so far, in the context of international criminal law, there really isn't a normal that we can measure other models against. I think we're still in a phase where we don't have, the ICC doesn't have comprehensive jurisdiction. There are always going to need to be supplementary approaches. And I suppose for me, more and more, as I look at what's happened in this field, I think about it as a menu of options, actually. We just need to have enough different options that we can draw on, enough tools in the toolkit that we can find a meaningful solution no matter what the circumstances are. I know a lot of people are asking the question about the IIIM and to what extent is this a model to be replicated, to be followed? As Mohammed said, we already see a very similar mandate for the Myanmar mechanisms, so it is already starting to happen. I think it's not surprising, actually, because I think what we have with the IIIM type model is very much an approach of building foundations on which you can then add, obviously, the jurisdictional part of it. So it's not at all a model that precludes the idea of the ICC in the future. It's not at all a model that's incompatible with proceedings in national systems, not at all incompatible with the idea that maybe someday there would be a dedicated tribunal or court for Syria. So I think that's really the strength of the model. It's work that would have to be done anyway. And so while those jurisdictional pathways may not be comprehensive now, why not use this time effectively to pull together the material, do the time-consuming, complex work of analysing and starting to conceptualise criminal law case files so that we're ready to go when we trust that there will be jurisdictional pathways opening up. I do think that in the context of Syria, there are some particular features that will influence the way that we interpret our mandate at the IIIM, and the level of activity in national jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, is clearly a feature that we don't necessarily see in relation to other conflict situations. And what that has provided is a really immediate avenue for the IIIM to be able to start adding value and having impact through the transfer of information and evidence, and hopefully the transfer of case files at a certain point as well. In other situations, there'll be additional features that we don't see in the context of Syria. So I think it is about having that flexibility, keeping a creative, open mind, and really seizing the opportunities where they are to promote a joined up approach to accountability across national and international jurisdictions, whatever that might look like in a particular context.
I may add one more thing for us. It's like IIIM was an opportunity actually to end an era of uncertainty about the work of the documentation on preservation of evidence, and also end the era of, I'm sorry, in the morning, crazy proposals that let's establish a tribunal in southern Turkey, let's do a tribunal in Lebanon, or let's drag the special tribunal of Lebanon to look at what's happening in Syria. Oh no, let's do a special tribunal in Aleppo, and now the SDF forces wanted a special tribunal to indict ISIS fighters. So all this hype between governments about creating more and more ad hoc tribunals and throw them on Syrians without actually consulting with Syrians in the first place, and try to understand what the impact, a negative basically impact on these mechanisms. The US Congress, for example, in 2015 issued a bill to give the sense of the Congress to talk to the administration, to ask the US ambassador at the Security Council, to ask the Security Council to establish a special tribunal, which was a fake bill, more or less, or a false hope to the Syrian people, because Russia will veto that right away. And so IIIM ended all that thing. Okay, now we're here, we're an independent entity, we're UN mandated, we're doing this work. And as Michelle put it eloquently, actually, no matter how the jurisdiction paths will end up going, hybrid tribunal, ICC, or even national jurisdiction in Europe, this is a UN mandated entity, works at the UN criteria levels of preserving evidence and maintaining chain of custody, and nobody can throw these crazy proposals at us more as Syrians and try to drag us to like we ended up between 2013 and 2015 just as organization fighting these crazy proposals because it's harmful to Syria, and unfortunately it was led by some former international practitioners who had names and weight to go to governments and try to pursue them to fund specific self-serving mainly mechanisms or initiatives. And I'm hopeful that we're done with that phase, and now we're in good hands with Michelle and the IIIM.
Okay, so Juan asked me to go, or allowed me to go first. So I think in answer to the question of, is this, what did you call it? The norm, right? The alternatives versus norm. I think this is absolutely the Colombian HIP and and it's not the HIP alone. It's working with two other institutions that are created by the peace process, a Truth Commission and a Unidad for finding the disappeared. So it's absolutely a sui generis mechanism, and it doesn't look that much like a lot of the mechanisms that have been made prior, and it's in particular because of the resolution that it's giving to the questions of punishment versus peace, right? It's absolutely a new approach, and it's fascinating to me that it's in Latin America where the strong stance on accountability and criminal accountability for human rights violations was developed. And it was from Latin America that it then spread, right, through the work of the Inter-American system and civil society, especially through the experience of the forced disappearances in the Southern Cone. So you get a very, in some ways, rigid and strong norm about punishment. And now it's in Colombia, which participated in the construction of this very strong norm through its civil society, it's one of the countries that has the most cases with Peru and Guatemala before the Inter-American system. So one of the countries that has forged that very strong norm of accountability. You have a new norm emerging about, well, maybe it's not all about punishment in the context of peacemaking. And it's interesting, and I think that it's a system that's been developed in close dialogue with the International Criminal Court through the preliminary examination. So it's a system that through this constant iterative dialogue with the ICC has participated in constructing, and it is vested in. So a failure of the Colombian peace process is a failure in some sense of the proactive complementarity and the ICC. This has become a test case in a sense. It's the first time the ICC has been so deeply involved for over 14 years in a preliminary examination in constant sort of adjustment and dialogue with the peace process. And it's also evolved in dialogue with the Inter-American system, which is just deeply embedded in Colombia. So I think that it's sui generis, but it stands in many ways to influence subsequent, because of this close interaction with these two international regimes that are primary regimes in these matters, it stands to influence subsequent, if it works, right? If it all works and the ICC doesn't eventually open an investigation, it will influence subsequent, and maybe it will then become a norm, at least in terms of the leniency and that approach to punishment. Also, I would like to add that ultimately, I think that if you think back to like the 2000 scholarship on the early 2000s, late 1990s scholarship on transitional justice, the whole idea was that this was a very exceptional regime, right? That there's nothing about it escapes normal law, and that's why you have to create alternative systems. And so the subsequent effort to create one-size-fits-all technocratic solutions was sort of doomed to run up against the paradox that no, these are exceptional regimes. It's sort of like the Tolstoy all families are unhappy in a different way idea, that you're going to have to create different solutions every time.
So I think I'll echo what a lot of what Alexandra said. I think the special jurisdiction for peace is alternative in many ways. It was originally designed to be a hybrid court, but then the participation of the foreign expert jurist was changed and made special or alternative in itself, if I may. Then the jurisdiction is alternative to the ordinary jurisdiction in Colombia as well, and it provides an alternative way of punishment. But at the same time, it's deeply influenced by what we would think are the ordinary actors in justice, both the ICC, which has Colombia under preliminary examination and has played a relevant role in the design of the special jurisdiction for peace, and the Security Council, which created a political mission in Colombia, and this political mission has been very vocal in a way defending the special jurisdiction against some of the attacks Alexandra mentioned. And I think this has helped gather lots of international support for the special jurisdiction for peace. So I'd say it's very sui generis, it's very alternative, but at the same time, there's a very relevant role by the ordinary actors.
So I want to pick up on some of these comments about the role of punishment in transition and in justice. So each of you have quite varied and extensive expertise, not only in the institutions that we're focusing on today, but obviously in others as well. And we're talking primarily about criminal prosecutions, which are, as I understand them, really the ultimate goal of the IIIM versus a broader, quite deliberately more expansive, less retributive focus in the Colombian process. So if you were thinking about sort of future approaches to post-conflict, post-violence, reconciliation, accountability, if we want to use that word, are there particular features of a situation that you think of as particularly salient in thinking about this question of whether punishment, traditional retributive punishment, or some other approach is most appropriate?
Can I go first?
Please.
I'm a survivor of torture myself. I'm a prisoner. So my father and my brother both ended up in prison at some point. And we gathered all in one military detention facility in 2006. So getting some accountability means a lot to me as a survivor, as a victim, as somebody who had to flee his country and become a refugee here. But this is a different scale after 2011. When you look at the amount of victims, when you look at the amount of perpetrators, and when you look at the competing priorities for the post-conflict Syria, if you look at the ICT1, ICTR, and just imagine they costed $2 billion each. And you look at the images of Syrian children freezing and cold in the camps in Lebanon every winter, like 7 or 8 of those kids died just this winter. And try to go to the community in Syria and say, you know what? We're spending another $2 billion to put 5 or 20 or 47 or 116 or whatever that the tribunal managed to put in prison. But you're going to remain in your tent for probably the next 3 to 5 years till we figure out something else. I don't think anybody in the country will be supportive. The competing priorities, however, should not really be a deterrence factor from the criminal prosecution itself, because if you want to add, just emphasize the respect of the justice norm itself, the criminal prosecution and imprisoning somebody and seeing somebody behind bars, it has all the value and the symbolism that somebody is being punished for what happened. And because of the cost of the violation so high, that should not be a reason where we flip the page and just forget about it and let's move on about reconstruction, rebuilding schools and hospitals, and getting the refugees back. So I think of all this when we talk to Syrian victims and constituents, because if you don't tailor the message for them about their suffering and their ending their misery as refugees or displaced people, they're not going to be necessarily supportive of these mechanisms, specifically if the mechanisms are still yet to be discovered, what they're going to do. Like they're still in the kind of intermediary phase where preparation and investigations are happening. One final comment is that resources should not be either or in the transitional justice scale. One good thing about, among the other list of good things about IIIM is that the transitional justice was referenced highly and highlighted in the TORs and the mandate and the resolution. So that's a positive thing itself. But usually, for example, reparation funds or victim reparations or reconciliation efforts, this falls usually down the line. And then when you end up prosecuting for specific crimes, in the eyes of the society, you're providing redress for specific victims and you're endorsing the hierarchy of victimization again. And that's another dangerous narrative in the Syrian conflict.
Well, obviously, as a prosecutor who's spent a career focusing on punishment, I'm coming at this from a very particular perspective, but I do have some observations, I think, that actually really connect with what you've just said, Mohammed. It's true, in the IIIM's mandate, we have, even if you just look at the title of the mechanism, it's to assist in the investigation and prosecution of serious crimes in Syria. So it's clear that we have been asked to focus intently on this idea of criminal prosecution and ultimately punishment. But indeed, if you read our terms of reference, this idea of criminal accountability is situated in broader language about transitional justice. So although our mandate isn't broad, it doesn't cover those other transitional justice areas, there's very much this philosophy that we have to look at accountability as one component of this much broader package of objectives. So where does that leave the IIIM? I mean, how should we be approaching this? Well, I think that, again, coming back to this idea of the central repository of information and evidence, what we see is that this is, if we can proceed to put this together effectively in the way that we plan, this is a resource that has value potentially way beyond criminal prosecutions. And one of the issues that we've immediately identified for us to really have a strategy on is the issue of missing persons. And you cannot have a conversation with someone affected by the conflict in Syria without this issue coming up. It is absolutely a number one priority for those affected by the conflict. So as we start collecting broadly from so many different sources and conscious that we will be bringing into our evidence collection material that might have a bearing on the whereabouts of missing persons, there might be among the material we collect leads that will be useful for those who do have a mandate to search for the missing. So what should we do about that? Well, we think the only moral thing that we can do is make sure that we structure our work in a way that means those leads can be channeled into the work of the ICRC or the ICMP as quickly as possible. We don't want to wait until we've finished our work and then grant access to our archives for these purposes. So I think we are working really proactively around strategies like that. And I do think that that's probably one example, but more will emerge in the context of our work, given the value of the evidentiary material that we are bringing together.
So I'm going to, so this is a very difficult question that gets to the very heart, I think, of some of the main issue, perhaps, in the Colombian peace process. I mean, there's other main issues, but the question of punishment, and in a way, you, in your question, did what both, I think, the inter-American regime and the international regime and everyone was doing, which is packing together punishment and prosecution. And what the very complicated, very juridical, legalistic piece of Colombia tries to do is sort of unpack what prosecution means and take out investigation, finding, the truth, reparation, punishment, but then further unpacking punishment, which we always sort of conflated with incarceration, and saying there's other forms of punishment, and sending someone to remove landmines is also a form of punishment that actually contributes to the peace process, et cetera. So I think that the Colombian answer, I mean, it's still, the jury is out, right? We don't know if it's going to work, but I think it's a very interesting answer to this question of, how much does the human rights movement and even the international criminal system want to emphasize incarceration, and at what cost? And the Colombians seem to be saying, perhaps we can de-emphasize that, switch out, incarceration for other forms of, almost procedural justice, right? And the jury is out. We'll see if this is going to work. The question, of course, it's a very victim-centered piece, and the Accord, the biggest chapter of the chapters of the Accord by far, is the chapter focused on victims. So in the end, perhaps it will be the response of the victims to this particular solution to the punishment versus peace question that will tell us whether this is going to work.
So I think that the key question, or one of the key questions in the Colombian peace negotiations, was how to create a punishment that was legally admissible and therefore sustainable in time, socially acceptable for the Colombian society, obviously for the Colombian society, and politically feasible during the peace negotiations. And I think this was a very hard issue in the negotiations, and what the negotiators came up with was basically, let's create something that is ambiguous enough so we don't have to debate this forever. And so they came up with a definition that includes lots of ambiguities and loopholes and questions, which has been honed throughout the process, including in the renegotiation, in the implementing legislation, and should be clarified further during the implementation by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. At the same time, this continues to be a challenge in the political debate. The President Duque, the current president of Colombia, is proposing changes to the peace accord that would ensure that those who were convicted for committing sexual crimes against children cannot benefit from these alternative sentences. So this is an issue that's still open to debate, both in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and in the political context in Colombia.
I'll pose one last question before turning it over to the audience for Q&As, and I'll make it a really easy one. So name one feature that you think is most important in the design of an accountability mechanism that's seeking to respond to systematic human rights abuses.
Victim-centered.
I would say the same. Yeah.
Okay, I'll say something else. Just for the I was planning to say victim-centered, but let's say something else. It needs to be socially acceptable for the community.
Who's the community?
For the politically and socially acceptable in the country.
In the country.
So I want to answer the question that she sent us by email.
We do today.
Which is slightly different. Because I think it leads to perhaps more interesting things, which I had understood Sarah to be asking, what are some of the features that are interesting or work, or maybe that don't work? And I thought of two for the HIP. One is that this excessive complexity. So I think if you're going to build a sui generis mechanism in the middle of another very complex jurisdiction, with Colombia, it has not one, not two, but three high courts that already compete for jurisdiction. And if you're going to erect a new system in the heart of that, it should be simple and easy to understand. And this HIP is so complicated. At times I've thought it was a strategy to defect ICC review, because they're never going to understand where the case is supposed to go or what's supposed to happen next in order to open their own investigation. But I think that it also makes it, so that might be an advantage, right, to deflect the ICC, but it also means that victims don't know where to begin and and no one really understands the system well, and that's a problem. And then a really interesting feature of this tribunal, which sometimes leads to problems, but which hasn't really been highlighted very much, is that I think it's probably the most diverse tribunal in the world among any international or national jurisdictions. It has over half of the judges are women. Over 60% come from regions outside of Bogota, outside of the capital. 10% are indigenous peoples, and almost a quarter are either Afro or indigenous or both. Half of them are not criminal lawyers, which can lead to issues, but and over half are academics, which can also lead to issues. And only about half have ever worked in the judicial branch within Colombia. So it's an incredibly unique organ in this sense, and this gives it a vibrancy that is, and I think it's a unique tribunal in the world. Oh, and the age difference. Some of the judges, I didn't ask them their age, but they look like they're in their 20s, and some are sort of in their early 30s, and then you have some very old prominent scholar judges who are in their 70s and very well known. And so you also have very differences in sort of social capital that they bring and perspectives that they bring. So I think this is a really interesting feature. We'll see how it works. It has created some challenges for the HIP in their interaction with the regular judicial branch. You know, the judges are skeptical. Who is this young person of color who's talking to me? They've created, I think it has created issues with other institutions, and it makes it harder for the unity, right? The more diverse a body, the more challenge, the more you have to put into creating cohesion among the people. And that's been a challenge, an extra challenge amidst so many other challenges. And yet there's something really interesting and special and promising about that.
Great. Questions from the audience? If you could use the mic then. Please.
Good morning. This was an excellent panel. Thank you. My name is Ted Picone. I'm at the Brookings Institution, and I've been working on these issues for some time. So I have a question for each of you. Maybe this is more specific for Michelle on the IIIM, the question of archiving. So in a worst case scenario in which accountability doesn't work out, we don't really, other than patchwork of some national jurisdictions, there's no political consensus either in Syria or at the international level to pursue these cases in a criminal jurisdiction kind of way. What happens to this archive? Is there any thinking now, as you're putting all this together, to perhaps making it public at some point? Is there any arrangement with the UN or precedent that you would draw from on how to deal with that kind of scenario? And then on Colombia, I mean, a comment which is, don't forget, of course, that there's still conflict raging in the country with other armed groups, so it's even more complex. But the issue of the Duque vetoes, the president's vetoes, provisions of the HEP, can you play out what the scenario would look like in which, what happens now? I mean, we're supposed to have a congressional debate, then the Constitutional Court will review it again. Some say this is just a ploy by Duque to get advantage within his party heading into regional elections. So we should just disregard all of this as like shadow dancing. Can you say a bit more about where you think it's going to lead? Thanks.
Do you want to start?
You want to answer straight up? Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think definitely one of the big lessons learned from the past accountability processes is we need to be thinking about archiving from day one. So in terms of IIIM's archive, I think, again, drawing on precedents of the ICTY, ICTR, I mean, it seems pretty clear that our archive would be a UN archive, and it would be governed in accordance with UN regulations and procedures. But I think there are a number of things to say in addition to that, actually. The material that we're collecting, because large amounts of it have been collected by others, that doesn't mean that those other actors cease having their material. It's not that we're taking original copies and putting them into the IIIM's archive and then nobody ever gets to look at them again. So the original collectors of the material, on the whole, I mean, unless there's a particular reason why we would take the original, retain their material. And we make copies and we preserve forensic copies and we do our analysis. So I think that's one thing. So it's not just, I mean, there might be many ways of accessing material that is part of our archive. I think the other thing we've seen over the years is, again, it's an organisational thing, that there will be material that we collect that can be made public. And it is about making sure that we structure the database in a way to facilitate that. So I can definitely imagine there's a component of what we're putting together that is, there's no issue with making it public. There'll be other components of it where there really are issues which would prevent us from making it public, where you have witness protection concerns or other sensitive issues that have to be addressed. So it is going to be a case-by-case assessment, but certainly I think we can all understand the value of a resource like this and the need to be thinking strategically about realistically what can and can't be made available in the longer term.
So on the question of the veto, last month, President Duque vetoed 6 provisions in the statutory bill of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. This is a very complex legal issue because the legislative process in Colombia is very complex, because there is a special legislative process for the peace implementation, and because this is the first time in Colombian history a president vetoes a law that had already been reviewed by the country's constitutional court. Essentially, the law goes back to Congress, and if either of the either the House or the Senate approves the law, it's passed, but it has to go to be reviewed again by the Constitutional Court. Right now, Duque doesn't have the votes to have the law passed with his vetoes in either the House or the Senate. And it's most likely that the court will not accept his objections, his vetoes, because the court has already addressed these issues in its August 2018 judgment. So essentially, there is very little chance that this will produce change in the implementing legislation of the accord. What it will likely do is to delay the processes in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, because the system will not have a clear legal basis to which operate. So the question, I think, is why is the president doing this if it will not produce change and it will delay justice? And I think the answer is, as you signaled, political. There are regional elections this year in Colombia. Duque is very unpopular, or is slightly unpopular. He doesn't have his own political constituency. He doesn't have political expertise. And the best way to gain popularity for him is to criticize Venezuela, bring up debates about the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, or be hard on the armed groups with which, other than the FARC, with which Santos was seeking peace negotiations.
I don't have much to add.
We have about 9 minutes and I see 4 questions. So let's take them in groups of 2.
Okay. Patrick Labuda, New York University. So I have 2 very quick questions, one for our Colombia experts and one for our Syria experts. You mentioned victim-centric approaches. I mean, this is a big theme. And for Syria, what I'm wondering about is the recent Article 15 submission to the ICC prosecutor, where they're asking the ICC to get involved on Myanmar grounds in Syria. So to use the same theory that people deported from Syria into Jordan are potentially within the ICC's jurisdiction. And I'm just curious about your thoughts. Do you think this is, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about whether this is a good idea, essentially, because of course it targets a very narrow group of victims, only people who have been deported into Syria. IDPs within Syria would certainly not be covered, and of course people who are victims of torture obviously would not have their day in court. So if you could talk a little bit about that. On Colombia, I study the ICC's complementarity effect, and you talked a little bit about the ICC's role in Colombia, and I think this is really a fascinating topic. I just wonder, my question is very simple. I mean, what do you think is a red line for the ICC? When does the ICC have to intervene? What would Colombia have to do at this point for the ICC to actually open an investigation, because of course they've, and I see you shaking your head, because it seems to me like they have had ample opportunity to intervene up till now. So the question is, what would Colombia have to do for the ICC to actually open an investigation? Thank you.
Hi, Sutton Kim, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but I'm here in my personal capacity. My question was for Michelle. I'm interested in the evidentiary standards governing the use of open source evidence in judicial proceedings. So to the extent that the IIIM has open source evidence and it's assisting national jurisdictions, how have national jurisdictions, common law or civil law, used that in terms of its authenticity, reliability, excuse me, probative value? And then are you working on sort of harmonizing standards for the use of that type of evidence in national and international proceedings? Thank you.
So we have deportation theories, ICC red line on Colombia, and evidentiary standards.
I can
go ahead.
Yeah. I'm asking to go because I actually have a plane at noon, so I have to leave right at 10:30, and I really apologize for doing that. But I have a very full faith in Juan. But I do want to answer the ICC question because I find so interesting the way that Colombia is an incredibly legalistic society. So even in there's this what Colombians refer to as the Colombian paradox. So even in the midst of a 50-year civil war, and now as the Brookings Institute person said, there is ongoing violence. There's another terrorist group that hasn't been pacified, or a guerrilla that hasn't been pacified. FARC guerrilla are going back into the field or the jungle, and the violence is ongoing. So now I've lost my train of thought because I'm going to catch it. So the interesting thing is, in the midst of all this violence, there's this incredibly legalistic society. Everyone and all the lawyers in Colombia are very well read and understand the ICC. They've been working with the ICC preliminary investigation for 14 years. And the government lawyers are very savvy, and they've really played the ICC, I think. They have really involved the ICC. One of the first things that President Duque does after he hits this almost mortal blow, right, of these vetoing the statute of the hip, is he sends, an official to go and meet with the prosecutor of the ICC, explain the constitutional legitimacy of what they've done, and then comes back to Colombia and announces that the ICC prosecutor listened and understood their objections. I don't know what the prosecutor is actually thinking. It's really unclear what the ICC is going to do, but they just play the ICC, have gotten it vested in the construction of the peace process, so that if the ICC opens an investigation, it is a failure of the ICC, right? That will mean that the ICC failed in its preliminary investigation, in its 14, 15 years of ongoing investigation and conversations and pressuring. It will have failed to create peace in Colombia. It will have, so there's a really interesting dynamic in which the ICC has no exit strategy and can't really open an investigation. And the whole conversation is so procedurally rich and legally sophisticated that I think it becomes very difficult for the ICC. So I think it's a really interesting question and issue. And I'm sorry that I must run to the airport.
And we are going to have to close at 10:30. So I'm afraid we're not going to be able to take our last two questions, but if we could hear responses on the initial question.
Quickly on the Article 15 submission to the ICC, I look at these as more public advocacy submissions rather than litigation submissions, quite honestly, because based on the precedent that the ICC declined to open an investigation with the jihadi fighters coming from states member to the Rome Statute, I think the same reasoning, like it's narrow jurisdiction, it doesn't really fall in line with the ICC targeting most responsible people. So I think for the same reason, I expect the ICC to come back and say, sorry, we're not going to do it. It's a good exercise, though, to see the ICC opening investigation in Myanmar based on the Bangladesh jurisdiction to try to test that. I'm not sure how Jordan feels about this as a country in general. So would Jordan be pleased in general? And also there's, even if that proceeded, it's going to be very challenging because because if you look at the demography of Daraa, wasn't the most destroyed city or the most displaced city. So you'll find big chunk of the population, more than 50% of Daraa, stayed there, did not in the southern border with Jordan, did not face violations. So even from evidence and evidentiary and trying to prove what happened, it's going to be very challenging that those people were targeted comprehensively or targeted indiscriminately, and the level of displacement. So it's going to be a little bit challenging. There's one point here to link to the victim-centered issue. I had some communication with the colleagues who did the submission at Garnica 37. My concern is how the submission was portrayed on, I think, The Guardian or The Independent, The Guardian, if I'm not wrong, saying the first case against Assad, 28 victims, Assad and his brother. Like, it's not case, it's Article 15 submission yet. So the way that sometimes the media mispresent these facts to victims, play with their expectations, and then we'll just continue watching the ICC website till they say no, and then crush all these hopes. And that's very dangerous game. Like, if the media doesn't get their lines really in order, it's going to be like, we had the same issue with the IIIM at the beginning of the IIIM. Like, oh, a tribunal. Like, wait, it's not a tribunal. We had to write articles, explain to journalists, this is not a tribunal. You have to be very careful in your wording. And this is where actually I think the civil society's role to try to address these issues and keep the information. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Give the accurate information.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the expectation management issue. It's really a challenge, and something that I think we all need to work together on. Just a quick word on the Article 15 submission. It's not for IIIM, obviously, to have a view about this and whether it's in the interests of the victims. But just from a more legal theory point of view, I would just mention that although as I understand the submission, although the victim group indeed would be narrow in one sense, it's people who have fled into Jordan. In order to prove the crime of deportation, actually it seems that there would be the need for quite broad evidence about an overall coercive environment. And I think that depending on how that would play out, that could encompass evidence of a really broad range of crimes that have combined to create a coercive environment. So although the deportation itself is quite narrow, I think because this theory involves proof of a coercive environment, that really actually opens it up quite significantly. In terms of open source standards, indeed, this is a really big challenge, not only for us. I mean, it is a challenge for IIIM because we're collecting material and putting together case files in large part not knowing where they might end up. So to try and make sure that we are complying with procedural standards, including on open source for recipient jurisdictions that are as yet undetermined, is quite a challenge. And then when I think of open source in particular, it is such a developing area where I think many jurisdictions are still clarifying in their own system what those standards are going to be. So for us, it is about trying to consult widely to keep ourselves informed of what the developing standards are. We see some positive precedents in Sweden. For example, the War Crimes Unit was able to secure a conviction based on a video of an execution that was posted on Facebook. And although I think initially there were a lot of questions around what sort of challenges to authenticity, as that litigation proceeded, it was relatively straightforward, at least on issues of authenticity. The issues in the litigation ended up focusing on other things. So it's difficult to know at this stage, but it's definitely an area where, as you say, trying to promote coordination and common standards would really assist. There is work going on at the moment on what is called an open source protocol. Colleagues, I think, from the Human Rights Centre, Berkeley. So we are, of course, staying informed of those developments. We're very interested in them, and we hope that the timing will be good as we really gear up our case file building and transfer of materials. Hopefully, some of these developments will come to fruition.
Can I say one more?
We're out of time, I'm afraid, and my apologies that we can't continue the discussion into those whose questions we weren't able to answer. Please join me in thanking our terrific panelists, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.